compatriots. They were friends, colleagues. And this guy was making money on a lot of things, and they were so disgusted with him that they gave him this code name Crook, in Russian Zhulik. This is the only case when I came across a pejorative code name.
A memo in Dickstein's KGB file bluntly states, "We are fully aware whom we are dealing with. This is an unscrupulous type, greedy for money, consented to work because of money, a very cunning swindler." After a year and a half and payments worth today more than $130,000, the KGB is finally fed up and ends its relationship with Congressman Dickstein. In 1946, Dickstein retires from the Congress and is appointed to the New York Supreme Court. He dies 8 years later. No one ever suspects he was a paid Soviet spy until Weinstein and Vasiliev discover his file and reveal Dickstein's espionage in 1998. Between the two world wars, Stalin launches a ruthless campaign to transform the Russian economy and consolidate his power base. In the early 1930s, he reorganizes his state security agencies into the NKVD, which will eventually evolve into the KGB. One of the new organization's main concerns is the growing threat of Nazi Germany. Desperate to divine the intentions of this powerful new enemy, Moscow looks for agents who can circulate among the highest levels of Nazi society. The Russians find an American woman whose special abilities to combine charm and sensuality open the doors to Hitler's inner circle.
What some of the Soviet controllers did was to combine sexual athleticism with espionage in quite an exciting way.
In 1933, William Dodd, the newly appointed American ambassador to the Third Reich, brings his attractive 25-year-old daughter Martha with him to Berlin. Shortly after their arrival, she meets and falls deeply in love with Soviet diplomat Boris Vinogradov.
She met the diplomat, and to the best of what the records reveal, they enjoyed a love affair. And in the course of it, the diplomat, who was not an intelligence operative, but a regular diplomat, said to the intelligence folks, by the way, I'm sleeping with the daughter of the American ambassador to Germany. Does that have any interest to you? And obviously it had a great deal of interest to the intelligence folks, and they said, from this point on, she's your assignment. Make sure she's happy.
KGB file number 14449. It is Martha Dodd's file, and it contains orders from Moscow to Vinogradov in Berlin. They want him to turn his lover into a spy for the Soviet Union. The file also states that, according to our data, the mood of his acquaintance is quite ripe for finally drawing her into our work. The Soviets select a seasoned operative to be Dodd's contact. He passes as a reporter for the Russian news service Izvestia. Her KGB file clearly indicates why she has potential value to the Soviets. With the State Department's knowledge, Martha helps her father in his diplomatic work and is aware of all his affairs. Martha claims that the main interest of her life is to assist secretly the revolutionary cause.
She was a major acquisition for the Soviets because she offered not only access to documents that her father left about his office, she could wander in and out at will.
For the Soviets, the kind of information Dodd can access might be critical to the survival of Russia in the event of war with Germany.
I think that her information about the correspondence between the U.S. Embassy in Berlin and the State Department was very important, because in the late 30s, the Soviets were very concerned about by which road America would go in case of a war between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. That's why all this diplomatic correspondence was extremely important.
In an extraordinary note from Dodd herself that Vasiliev and Weinstein discover in her KGB file, she makes it clear that she has access to material from the highest levels of the U.S. government, and she's prepared to do anything that might be asked of her.
It goes without saying that my services of any kind and at any time are proposed to the party for use at its discretion. Currently, I have access to the personal, confidential correspondence of my father with the U.S. State Department and the U.S. President.
In 1934, Dodd's Soviet lover Vinogradov is recalled to Moscow, yet she continues to assist the KGB by sleeping with the enemy.
She also moved in the highest diplomatic and political and military circles. And mind you, took lovers in many of those circles, despite the fact that her primary lover, the love of her life, as she said, was this Soviet diplomat. But that didn't stop her from moving about and leading a very energetic social life, let me put it that way.
The long list of her lovers eventually includes German aristocracy, members of the Gestapo, and General Ernst Udet, second only to Hermann Goering in the German Air Force. Dodd supplies Moscow with remarkably valuable pillow talk, a stream of confidential data about German military units, tactics, and procedures. She forwards reports of Roosevelt's informal and private discussions about U.S. policy toward Poland, Japan, Germany, and Russia. She even offers to use her influence with her father and others to help the Soviets handpick her father's successor. According to Dodd's KGB file, her handlers take the extraordinary step of asking Stalin himself how she might best be used. By 1937, war is imminent and Dodd's days in Berlin are numbered. Yet she still yearns for Vinogradov, who has been transferred back again to Moscow. Desperately, Dodd flies to Moscow and presents a letter to her KGB contacts.
I, Martha Dodd, U.S. citizen, have known Boris Vinogradov for 3 years in Berlin and other places, and we have agreed to ask official permission to marry.
This letter on several pages went straight to Joseph Stalin, and Joseph Stalin himself took the decision to continue using her as a source.
Moscow delays responding to Dodd's request. Late in 1937, her father resigns his post as ambassador and Martha reluctantly returns to America. Unknown to her, Vinogradov is arrested when Stalin purges his diplomatic corps of those he suspects are disloyal. Before Vinogradov is executed, the KGB forces him to write to Dodd as if nothing is amiss. Martha writes back, unaware that her lover is dead.
What I like about Martha Dodd also is that in a conversation, she once said, I have a weakness for the Russians. There is something in them. It's very flattering, isn't it?
In 1940, Martha Dodd is back in the United States. She marries and fades into the background, working as a spotter who identifies other potential agents for Moscow, including her husband. In the early 50s, an FBI investigation names her as a suspected Soviet spy. With her husband, she flees to Moscow and then Eastern Europe, where she lives out her days. In 1990, she dies at the age of 82.
I think it's reasonable to think of Martha Dodd as an American Mata Hari to some extent, since, she did manage to combine sex and espionage in a personally fulfilling way, I think.
And particularly fulfilling to the Soviets were Martha Dodd's detailed accounts of German military plans and procedures, as well as her vivid descriptions of debates among FDR's inner circle during the critical years leading up to the war. It made her a very important Soviet asset in the 1930s. KGB File 36857, Lawrence Duggan. In 1934, Duggan is a youthful idealist on the State Department fast track. Like hundreds of other young activists who come of age in the Depression years, he goes to Washington to work in Roosevelt's New Deal government. Soviet agents, among them Alger Hiss, soon identify him as a desirable recruit.
Lawrence Duggan is typical of one kind of Soviet agent who was being recruited in the 1930s, not simply in the United States, but in Britain and elsewhere. That is to say, a high-flying, naive idealist. Larry Duggan did not become a Soviet agent for any mean or selfish motive. He started working for the Soviet Union because he thought it was the right thing to do. Here was a society which represented a kind of social justice that the West did not.
Duggan is such an attractive prospect that two different Soviet spy networks compete to recruit him. According to his KGB file, in 1936, Duggan is drawn into the shadowy world of Soviet espionage by Hedda Gumpers, an anti-Nazi German exile and Russian agent. Duggan provides her with valuable information, including copies of diplomatic cables from U.S. embassies in Europe, as well as a copy of the classified State Department employee list and handbook. As Duggan rises in the hierarchy of the State Department, his access to valuable information increases, which naturally enhances his value to the Soviets. But he also learns more about Stalin's purges and the power struggles in Moscow. The news makes him uneasy. Even more alarming to Duggan are reports of defectors, former Soviet agents seeking to escape Stalin's reign of terror. One potential defector, Ignaz Rees, is in a position to blow Duggan's cover, but the Soviets are ruthlessly determined to protect him.
Ignaz Rees is killed in part because of his knowledge not only of European agents, but because he knew via other parties of a number of the key figures in their American networks.
A note in the KGB archives reads, "Rees is liquidated, but not yet his wife. So far we do not know to what extent she knows about Duggan and what steps she will take in the future. Now the danger that Duggan will be exposed because of Rees is considerably decreased." His secret intact, Duggan is promoted to the head of the State Department's Latin American division and then to the sensitive post of personal assistant to Secretary of State Cordell Hull. He also acquires a friend and supporter who could help him rise even further, the Vice President, Henry Wallace.
This country belongs to all of us, and we have got to keep it at work to keep it strong.
In Larry Duggan, the KGB came closest to achieving the biggest success it had ever achieved in the United States. We now know that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was terribly, terribly ill in 1944. In 1944, and for the previous 4 years, his vice president was Henry Wallace. Now, Henry Wallace had already worked out the major appointments in a Wallace administration. Had Roosevelt died in 1944, as it's entirely possible that he would have done, then we would have had a President Wallace. And we now know who the Secretary of State to President Wallace would have been. It would have been Larry Duggan, a Soviet agent.
It is among the greatest what-if stories in the history of espionage. This decoded Soviet cable indicates how close Russia came to placing an agent in one of the highest offices in the United States. Kinyats is the Russian codename for Duggan, and Lotzman is Henry Wallace. The cable reads, "If Lotzman gets an interesting post, it goes without saying Kinyats must get in on it by using his friendship." However, this scenario never unfolds, and Duggan's world begins to crumble when former Soviet agent Whittaker Chambers identifies Duggan as a secret communist to a State Department security official. He resigns his post as Secretary of State Hull's advisor and tries to cut off all contact with his former spy masters. But details in his KGB file show that he is relentlessly pursued by his Soviet handlers.
And one of the things that we tend to forget nowadays is the sheer tension that accumulated in some of those people in the United States who were working for the Soviet Union at the end of the Second World War.
In December 1948, the FBI steps up the pressure on Duggan, questioning him about his relationship with Alger Hiss. Virtually on the heels of FBI questioning, the KGB comes knocking, demanding to know if Duggan talked. At 9 a.m. on December 20th, 1948, only days after his KGB interrogation, Duggan enters his office in New York. At 10 a.m., he plunges 16 stories to his death. Did he jump, or was he pushed?
It's not certain that Larry Duggan committed suicide. He certainly fell from a very great height, and it's a very unusual kind of accident.
Duggan's KGB file lays bare the details of how thoroughly Soviet agents penetrated the State Department. But recently uncovered KGB files also reveal how deeply Soviet spies penetrated another U.S. agency, a very secretive agency, the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS.
There were a number of specific agents within the OSS who worked for the Soviets who passed along a variety of materials. And obviously, if you're running a foreign intelligence agency, it is useful, perhaps best, not to have double agents in your midst. The OSS had a number of them.
KGB File 45049, Duncan Lee. Lee is a Yale graduate and Rhodes Scholar. When his mentor and former law partner, General Wild Bill Donovan, creates the Office of Strategic Services in 1942, Donovan recruits Lee to be his assistant.
The ultimate dream for any intelligence agency is to recruit the head of another intelligence agency. Now, if you can't do that, recruiting his right-hand man is the next best thing, and Stalin got the next best thing, and his name was Duncan Chaplin Lee.
Lee's broad access to OSS operations makes him